South, there have been thousands of racially motivated murders.
We need your help.
Dr. King, this thing's just gonna have to wait.
It cannot wait.
You got one big issue, I got 101.
Selma it is.
Here is the
That was a clip from the new movie Selma, which has raised some eyebrows for its portrayal of President Lyndon Johnson as being not just resistant, but even more forceful than that to the push for civil rights in the 60s. Now, Johnson's defenders and some historians, they've objected, saying the movie doesn't accurately portray the president, and citing LBJ's commitment to the cause as well as his support for the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and more. So the question is, how much does the media's retelling of a president's legacy impact how that president's remembered? Historical retellings, they pop up all the time in movies. You may have seen, it's a terrific movie, I thought, Richard Nixon's more dramatized interview with David Frost in the movie Frost-Nixon. Different than the reality, but it was still a movie. We also got a reimagining of President Franklin Roosevelt, as David well knows, and his personal life in the 2012 film Hyde Park on Hudson, a film panned by critics and also quite a few historians. And yet, FDR's complicated personal life with his wife Eleanor and his historic imprint in this country was much more warmly received than last year's Ken Burns film, The Roosevelts. It was a documentary and not obviously a work of fiction, but more historically accurate feature films like 2012's Lincoln, they can help humanize presidents who served well before the advent of modern media. Then again, the Lincoln we saw on film was Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, and obviously not the man himself, although Daniel Day-Lewis did a heck of a job. Okay, we'll talk about it from a person who was involved with some of the folks that were creating these images and trying to recreate history, both in a dramatic feature film, but then also, conversely, in a documentary, albeit a series. How complicated is it to bring history to life?
Well, it is complicated, but we were speaking about this before the coming on air, and I think a lot of it has to do with tone. You know, as a historian, you obviously know the backstory, you know the details, and it can drive you crazy. But the thing to do is to look at the whole product. For example, Warm Springs, which depicted Roosevelt's disability. You know, again, I thought it was extremely well done and captured the tone, his triumph over disability, the difficulties he faced, his focus initially on himself, and then his sort of realization that he's not the only disabled person in the world, and so forth and so on. So I think it did a good job. Historically, were there inaccuracies? Yeah, there were all kinds of inaccuracies, but the tone was right. I have not seen Selma, I'll confess to that. I think all of us probably would agree that Lyndon Johnson was critical to the civil rights movement and supported civil rights. When, how much, you know, the nuances, those are things that historians like Robert Caro dig down and you know, when you get right down to it, there are political considerations that a president has to go through that, you know, if you take that moment in time may somehow taint his image. So there's a bit of selection that goes on with historians, but also with filmmakers. And that can have an impact. When it distorts history or purposely tries to change or distort history, that's when I think I object. If it captures the tone, I'm comfortable with it.
For a person that I know knows just about every possible detail there was to not just the life but the presidency of not just FDR but also the role that Eleanor Roosevelt played in there, it's impossible. But when you had a documentary like Ken Burns, the amount of people I know, David, that said, I had no idea X. I had no idea Y. Right. It brings to life a person that sometimes gets stuck in the stacks or is from a bygone generation. That's extremely, I think, important because all of a sudden FDR's legacy got redebated all over again in the last 6 years, you know, since President Obama and sourcing him as such a imprimatur on the way he looks at it. It can't be exaggerated, the power that a single film or a documentary can have to a whole new generation as to who a person was and what they stood for.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent, you know, the media does damage when the media says Franklin Roosevelt planned Pearl Harbor. And it gets interpreted by young people, for example, in particular, that was a fact. The media does a wonderful job when it captures the essence of an era, which I'm hoping is what's happening in the Selma film, which as I said, I haven't seen. Ken Burns' film with Jeff Ward's fantastic writing, you know, they had many, many hours to tell that story, and so we got the detail. So when you're dealing with a fictionalized, you know, film, a 2-hour film or an hour and a half, 2-hour film, you know, it's much more difficult to capture the details accurately. So what I look for usually is, have they captured the essence of that era? Have they captured the essence of the man? You know, there are, no president is perfect. There are downsides to virtually all of them. You know, if the filmmaker is good, then you get somewhat of a picture of all those dimensions. You
know, Yank, when you did one of your books, the book specific I'm talking about on at that moment in time with Sputnik, but obviously so much as it related to Eisenhower, do you run the risk as historians that you fall in love with your character and you kind of airbrush out the dark spots? For example, I had a conversation early last week with a Times reporter who also authored a book on what happened after we liberated those detention camps in World War II. If you believe Bill O'Reilly's version of Patton, you know, he completely omitted the anti-Semitic part and the horrible things that were said and done to the very folks that we liberated after the horrors in Auschwitz and other camps. Is there a risk that sometimes blind spots come into historians, and then when they see a film on it, they don't want to see those parts emphasized and they just want the good parts?
That's definitely a trouble spot for historians. When you are living, breathing, and working with your historical subject, you tend to sympathize with that subject, especially if you've met your subject. Like with Gerald Ford, I actually met him and interviewed him. With Eisenhower, I got to interview some of the last surviving members of the Eisenhower administration, and you begin to sympathize with the problems that the president was working with and dealing with. So that is a trouble spot to avoid. But I think the films and history are really good for our profession because they do reach a much larger audience than our books do, and it's a different way of storytelling. And as long as the film viewing public understands that you have to take things with a grain of salt, that some things are distorted, that Hollywood always looks for a villain.
But that point, though, Duran, it was interesting. I don't know if you saw the 60 Minutes piece recently where they interviewed the filmmaker of Selma, and they brought up the considerations and some of the concerns and criticisms of folks who said, wait a minute, the retelling, especially of the role that LBJ played in this, wasn't the one that they found through history. She said, listen, I read through all the papers, right? I read through all other people's books and recounting, but I had my own version of what I believe, and none of us were in the room with Lyndon Johnson, what happened in those conversations with the late Dr. King, and that's what's reflected in my film. How much liberty, especially with the impact to younger people who are only learning about these events through a movie, through 2 hours or maybe a chapter in school in one history textbook, how much danger and power and benefit is there when it's really through discretion of a filmmaker or whoever it may be?
I think it's incumbent, to use a pun, it's incumbent upon the filmmaker to do something that I saw Spike Lee do over 20 years ago when the Malcolm X movie came out with Denzel Washington in the title role. In the credits, he said, read the book, the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think a lot of what we're talking about depends on the public's willingness to read the source material. None of us at this table actually saw the Selma movie yet, but I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to read again the materials that are open to me and then walk into the film so that the film is not the thing that teaches, and I think everybody should do this. The film is something you compare it with.
Andrew, so you know Andrew can probably quote verbatim, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He's one of the few guys who knows Westwood better than I do. We know how much this medium, whether it's TV or film, can impact, especially people who want things in digestible things. They're not going to read the book as much as they may be imparted to at the end of the film in the credits. There's a risk, but there's also a chance. I mean, Lincoln opened eyes to what the country was like at a chapter in history that maybe they were glazing their eyes over in the history class.
It gives people a chance to put presidents and historic moments into perspective and to humanize what we read in the history books and share how people are feeling at that given time, which really adds a layer to it. It can also be, I worry that it can be open to a little bit of push from people. Presidents like Frost Nixon, there are still plenty of people around who worked with Richard Nixon or who are fans of Richard Nixon who gently try to alter the legacy or the perception of a president after he's out of office. And of course, you're looking for sources. You're going to talk to people who were involved. And so it's possible to sort of push a president's positive legacy or an agenda, so forth, into the forefront of a movie or even a history book. So.
Well, and that leads us to our next segment. When we come back, the man next in line for the film treatment, our current president, Barack Obama. What will his legacy be? Our panel will weigh in on that when we return.